Yes, wonderful. So, hello everyone, and good early afternoon or evening or very early morning, depending on where you are at. We are thrilled to be presenting to you today on really what is going on in the language services industry in 6 months into 2021. What are the trends and what are the actionable takeaways for you as LSPs or maybe as individual linguists in your day-to-day work. So a couple of housekeeping items. This is being recorded. We will share the recording via download link, which you afterwards, so be on the lookout for that. And also, the way we're structuring this is that we will be talking for approximately 40-ish minutes. And we do anticipate a Q&A session, or we do plan for it. So if you have any questions, feel free to jot them down in the chat. We will be taking those and answering them once we finish with our presentation here. So that's as far as housekeeping items. Without further ado, let's dive in. Great. So as you may be already familiar with Nimdzi Insights, and just as a quick reminder, Nimdzi Insights is a market research and consulting company covering the language services industry. Who are we? Who is Sarah and Gabriel, the two people talking to you here today? So just to get a sense of where we are coming from. So myself, my name is Gabriel Kanadiszowski. I'm the Chief Operations Officer at Nimdzi. My experience in the industry comes predominantly from the LSP side, having held various roles from sales and marketing to production, from a small, medium-sized type of very niche LSP in the video game localization industry to working at one of the biggest MLVs in the market, and then joining Nimdzi. In Nimdzi, as part of my responsibilities, leading our team of researchers and writers, is also working with our clients, and more our clients on the language services buyer end of things. And a few examples you see there are around the topics that I usually work with them on, whether that is buyer behavior or go-to-market expansion, brand awareness studies, and so on. So yeah, over to you, sir.
Yeah, hi, my name is Sarah Hickey. I am the VP of Research at Nimdzi Insights. In my previous life or career before, I am a trained translator and conference interpreter. I also have a background in journalism. I used to work for a radio station and as a reporter. And now I run Nimdzi's large market research studies. For example, the Nimdzi 100 that you might be familiar with, or the Interpreting Index, and many other in-country reports that we often do in association, in cooperation with associations. Sorry. And because of my background in interpreting, I'm also responsible for all of the interpreting research, including virtual interpreting technology. Right. So now that you know us a little bit better, let's dive right in. But before we get to the trends and opportunities, let's take a super quick look at the current size and growth projections for the language industry. Our data show that even in 2020, the language industry once again grew. Prior to the pandemic, we had projected that the industry would reach $57 billion in 2020, and that it would continue to grow at a compound annual growth rate, or CAGR, at 6.2%. But once the pandemic hit, we had adjusted our growth forecast down to 2.5% for 2020 and 5% thereafter. Our data now show that the language industry did in fact continue to grow in 2020, just at a slower rate than in the previous years due to the disruption caused by the pandemic. We estimate that the industry reached $55 billion in 2020. And we're also putting our growth estimates back on track and predict that the industry should grow to $58.3 billion in 2021. Considering a CAGR of 6%, the industry would be valued at $73.6 billion by 2025. Okay, so now that we know the size of the market, let's talk about some of the key trends that are shaping our industry right now. And we're kicking it off with a very bold statement. That is that the LSP is dead. Well, before we get into exactly what we mean by that, let me clarify that this trend is only partially true. It's a reality for the bigger companies in the industry, so like the ones on the Nimdzi 100 ranking or the ones that aspire to become a big player. It is not necessarily true for the smaller companies that are still the biggest part of the language industry. They actually make up about 80% of the market, according to our estimate. So what do we mean when we say that the traditional concept of a translation company is dead? Well, a trend that is not new, but stronger than ever, is that the largest LSPs are moving away from transactional work and towards master service agreement-based business. At the same time, the needs of localization buyers have become more complex, and LSPs are responding to this development by, for example, providing adjacent services. Examples of these are, among others, digital packaging or cloud recording in the media industry, or content management, content creation, and copywriting in other industries. As a consequence of this development, LSPs are increasingly becoming corporate service providers, or rather business partners, to help clients expand their international business. To know that the acronym of LSP is obsolete, we just need to have a look at the biggest players in our ranking. Companies like TransPerfect, Lionbridge, RWS, or Keywords are certainly not just offering language services to their clients. Language services are just one part of their revenue. These companies have been able to pivot and tailor their services to cater to the needs of their clients. And that is one of the reasons why they have been able to thrive. What all of this shows is that we need to update our concept of LSP to one that reflects this new complexity. We need to start talking about strategic partners for global business rather than just language service providers. Right, so now that we know that, how are companies in the Nimdzi 100 ranking achieving this transition from LSP to strategic partner for global business? Well, according to our research, technology is the biggest ally in the move towards achieving this transformation. 2020 showed that companies with a solid technical infrastructure were not only able to survive the pandemic, but to grow their business. Why? Well, because they were able to respond quickly to their clients' challenges, such as scalability, productivity, limited budgets, and need to deliver services, the same services remotely, for example, in case of interpreting or dubbing. And our thesis is that LSPs that only offer language services or language technology providers that only offer language technology will have limited value for more mature clients. Offering a combination is the way forward. In 2020, we witnessed significant mergers and acquisitions that support this thesis. We had RWS and SDL, Straker and Lingotech, Avatera and Speakers, and Deluxe and Sundog. All these LSPs are acquiring technology companies to provide a better service to their clients. And we will probably see more of these marriages between LSPs and language technology companies, as well as more LSPs creating or increasingly investing in their own technology. At the same time, we have seen how companies are investing in developing AI-enhanced language portals to simplify and automate workflows for transactional work. So instead of ignoring a big part of the market with these small translation requests that don't require very complex workflows or a lot of account management, some companies are investing in creating language portals that offer translations or even interpreting services as a commodity, like buying products from Amazon. The key to productivity here is to create an automated system where human interaction is the exception.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. And this is a nice segue into the next slide over here. And I want to stop here and talk about language technology for a second. We're very much in an industry that is driven by technology, and it's very central to the way we do things, whether that's traditional localization workflows, both on the LSP side, but also on the buyer side. So I want to bring in the perspective of how buyers engage with language technology. What is their perspective here? So Throughout our research and the qualitative feedback that we have and the data that we have shows that it is really the buyers that drive the technology discussion. I'm going to use an example here, and that is machine translation. So very recent research that we've done for the Nimdzi 100 shows that today, machine translation is just about 70% of LSPs globally offer MT-related services as part of their offering. These days, MT is practically a must, and it's really the second service in terms of frequency, so to speak, in the LSP's roster. However, there is the element of LSPs doing it and offering MT-related services because they have to, because the buyers want it. We have found that just about 11% of the LSPs, or on average, 11% of the revenue of companies doing MT is derived from the service. So MT is a service that needs to be there, but it's not much of a revenue generator. And the impetus towards having MT as part of the service offering is coming firmly from the buyers, who see this not even necessarily as a cost, as a means to achieve cost efficiency and to optimize cost of localization, but as a means to churn out content quickly in various languages. Then again, there's another trend here, and this is the importance why we're talking about trends, and because they inform then what are the decisions those companies are making. And so if you think about language technology, the nature of it, of the technology stack at companies is cyclical. So by this, we understand that as the technology is improving, moving at a very fast speed, there always comes a point every 5 to 6 years that buyers need to refresh their tech stack. And right now, our data suggests that this is happening. You see a lot more talk about MT, and MT is really mainstream these days, but you see AI becoming a topic of discussion. So right now is the time that a lot of these companies that are at various stages of their maturity level and various stages of their path towards a global domination, they are looking at ways to refresh their tech stack. So doing TMS audits, developing, what are the new systems out there that allow them to integrate all of their own internal technology systems. And it's really about this. As Sarah mentioned, to her point, that operations are getting more and more complex by virtue of technology advancing, new companies, new startups coming up with new solutions to various challenges. There's no such thing as less technology. And there's more and more the need to integrate with, from an LSP's perspective, with these various stakeholders at your client side. And one of the things that we've come across repeatedly when engaging with the buyers is the concept of effortless. So beating the drum of more and more complexity, there's also this need and this willingness to simplify. So the more technology implies more development work, but companies and on the buyer side, they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to onboard a lot of new people. So this is where LSPs come in to offload some of that burden in making multilingual content available for these companies. So it's about finding ways how you can help your clients to produce content in an effortless way. So that's really a buzzword for us here. So you may be wondering, where are we getting this from? So over the past year or so, we've been running a series of reports here at Nimdzi called Lessons in Localization. And what we are doing is, on a regular basis, practically every week, we are running interviews with buyer-side organizations around what is their setup, what does their supply chain look like, what technologies they use. And we've come to a point where we've done this 30 to 40 times already, and we're starting to see what are maybe some of the overarching trends that govern how buyers of language services or the localization managers, what they need to take into account. So some of what you see over here are really overarching trends that are happening in the industry. And if there is one takeaway, is that the trend are as varied as the different buyers you have. Different companies from tourism to hospitality will have different challenges, different problems than companies in IT, automotive, or life sciences. So it's not much of a takeaway, and it's rather obvious, but you need to have really an open mind here and being exposed to the variety of different challenges that you may experience with your buyers. Another element that we see, and really talking about the macro trends here, there's a lot of talk about users, individuals like me, Sarah, and you, shifting our attention more towards online, and this has been no doubt accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic as well, where all of a sudden all of us had all this time to spend online, but not just online, but mobile. So the data shows that there's a clear push towards mobile accessibility and engaging with content, engaging with brands, buying products on the go, using your tablet or your mobile phone. That is clearly where we are headed. To give you an example, the global projections for e-commerce are beyond $4 billion US in this year, and more than half of that is projected to come from mobile e-commerce. So there is this technology is making things more accessible. In turn, you could argue that access to internet and to online services is more democratic than it has ever been. And what this means as well, and there is talk about pockets of like countries or regions where there are really millions of users, hundreds of millions of users who will gain access to this technology. And this is especially true in markets such as in Southeast Asia, countries like India or Indonesia, but also in Africa or in South America. So there's more users than ever getting online, and these people have money to spend clearly on products and services. So what do these buyers think about? Like what do they want to do? And for them, it's important to stand out in what is becoming an increasingly crowded market, regardless of what that market is. So it's all about the end user. The buyers are in a logic of understanding the user and understanding what makes us as individuals and potential buyers tick, what are our sensibilities, and then appealing to them. So this is the concept of hyperlocalization. How do we craft the product, and it also, it's not just about how you market it, but it goes further upstream in how you design the product for these international audiences, going beyond elements of language and the translation aspect of it, but taking into account cultural nuances, religion elements, and appealing to all of these sensibilities which vary from country to country. And then another important factor worth mentioning here, and this again might be obvious, but another big guideline for these companies is they need to do things in a certain way depending on the industry. So if we're talking about healthcare or life sciences, there are regulations in place that govern how companies need to operate in specific markets. But it's not just about regulations that are specific to an industry, but there may be also regulations for a specific country. And the example we use a lot, and when we have clients of our own who are wondering about go-to-market expansion, and for example in France, and the example we like to use in France, you have the Toubon law, which prescribes companies or organizations of any kind to use French in instances such as advertising, contracts, or at the workplace. So these companies, as they are opening up to the global audiences, they need to be exposed to all of these things, and regulations play a big part also in conditioning their strategy. So they need to be mindful of that. This will, of course, apply more in certain industries than others, but it's definitely a factor. So, next slide, sir.
Yeah, back to me, I think. So, as Gabriel already mentioned, there's a real push towards everything moving online. This was already true before the pandemic, but COVID-19 accelerated this trend significantly because of the repeated lockdowns. And two areas that illustrate this nicely are e-learning and e-commerce. E-learning was already on the rise prior to the pandemic, but has since seen a notable uptick as people are using the time at home to upskill. And also any form of corporate training needs to happen remotely as well. So this has given rise to an explosion of e-learning content, and platforms. For the language industry, this means more content, which again means more opportunity for growth. And one segment to highlight within this field is the area of subtitling for corporate videos, which has seen a significant increase. The main challenges to address with e-learning localization are low budgets, scalability, and complex non-standardized workflows and content types. What might help to overcome these challenges are automatic captions, machine translation, and synthetic voices, as well as utilizing the expertise of media service providers. And then there is e-commerce, which broke all records in 2020. Gabe already alluded to this as well. According to McKinsey, the US e-commerce market experienced 10 years worth of growth in only 3 months in early 2020. And eMarketer estimates that the global e-commerce industry grew by 27.6% to more than $4 trillion in 2020. This boom in e-commerce is coming from two sides. First, there are the established e-commerce platforms like Shopify that experienced record growth in 2020. The current gross merchandise volume, or GMV, of this e-commerce giant stands at $120 billion after an impressive 86% growth in GMV. On top of that, as the lockdowns continued, there was a notable shift in the number of the traditional brick and mortar stores participating in the online market, which is the second factor that boosted growth in the e-commerce field. Well, more e-commerce, again, means more online content, which naturally triggers higher localization demand. And as our Project Underwear study into buying behavior shows, offering a product or service in a consumer's native language influences their buying decision. What is important to remember is that while we always talk about e-commerce as a vertical, it really is just a way of selling, and in that regard offers endless opportunities for all business segments.
Thank you. So really something to keep in mind here is this is a two-way kind of highway. On one end, you have the buyers, or let's say the companies, the enterprises, and so on. And on the other hand, you have end consumers, people like us. And so what the companies are trying to achieve is appeal to these buyers by all means possible. This is a business world, right? And the intent is to sell, is to grow the audience and transform that into revenue. So as Sarah mentioned, one of our landmark studies at Nimdzi called Project Underwear. This is one of the key takeaways that you're seeing, is that 9 users out of 10 will ignore a product if it's not in their native language. And it's a data point that we like to use often because it's not only, it should hit home and hit hard, not only for buyers, because there's the realization that they need to provide their products and services in the native language, but it's also something that we argue LSPs and linguists can use as well. I mean, this has maybe been your experience as well, oftentimes in situations where you want to justify the need to, why is it that my client should localize, and you're making the case to them. And this goes back to a previous point I was making. It's really all about the end users. In this, the market, and we're saying like a lot of internet connectivity, so people being online, people using their mobile devices. The point is, people engage with companies in different ways. There's practically a product for everything, and it's very important for brands to give users a choice. So you see big e-commerce platforms being available online now, having their own apps. But giving users a choice, well, is not only about the format of how you engage with them, whether that's e-learning, whether that's video, but it's also giving them a choice with language. And the data supports that, offering them the choice of engaging with the product in their native language will ultimately drive engagement. So a moment here to talk about hyperlocalization really at work. The concept of going beyond just the language aspect of it. And the example that you see over here is from Farfetch, a company that runs an online luxury brand e-commerce platform. So what they do is they have, and it's an interesting case in itself because they do not outsource localization, they do everything internally. And what they do is they have content production teams in different regions, in different countries. And the example that we're using here is for Arabic-speaking markets, they have a whole section of their website dedicated, and as you see, titled Ramadan, where they select products that based on certain criteria, of course, but products that may appeal to the local audiences. So companies really are in this logic of tailoring the experiences to their users. Another very example that you may be familiar with, businesses doing or being active in Japan, there's the element of seasonality. So with different national holidays and so on, and you have the Sakura season that you may be familiar with cherry blossom trees, and the whole kind of visual element that implies the use of color and so on. So brands are incorporating elements of color as well, and how people react to imagery into the way they approach it. And you look at whatever global websites of different brands, and the use of colors, the use of text, and the use of imagery changes. So this is really what we refer to as hyperlocalization, going beyond just the text, just the language elements, and appealing to the users in ways that they can identify themselves with the brand and what it means to convey. So another element here, and again, in this whole logic of more content, we're talking about more content. What more content means is that companies are exploring avenues how to leverage that content. So they are multiplying the streams where they can reach their audiences, and social media is the obvious way to do this. But maybe a non-obvious way how to engage with users is through digital influencer marketing. So really, companies working with in-country producers of content, with influencers to create video content, to create podcasts, and Shopify is doing it, the example Sarah mentioned, where they work with local recording studios, so dubbing studios or voice recording studios, to create content for the local markets. And we have an example here just after this slide of AliExpress, who are doing the same thing. And this is another interesting use case where AliExpress has a global platform where they work with in-country studios again and influencers to promote certain categories depending on the country, what is more relevant in each of these markets. And it's a big part of what they're trying to do and reach the consumers. So it's really about the multiplication of content, but also the ways that companies use that to reach their audiences.
Yes, and when we talk about new types of platforms, it really is also new types of media. And the media industry has been very busy. A lot has happened in the media industry over the last few years, and in turn, media localization has been a growing segment of the translation industry for a while now. Especially due to the rise of Netflix and other streaming platforms, companies offering subtitling and dubbing are in high demand. Media localization companies featured on the Nimdzi 100 ranking grew by average 17.4% in 2020 as compared to 2019. This is impressive if we consider that content production slowed down significantly due to lockdown measures. That being said, it needs to be highlighted that a lot of this growth can be attributed to M&A activity. And some of these activities were unrelated to language services. And then another part of this growth can also be attributed to the diversification of services in the media localization space. Actually, if we disregard a major non-language services related acquisition by Switzerland-based media localization company SwissText, then the media localization companies in our ranking only grew on average by 2.4%, sorry. But they still grew, and that during very challenging times. And one reason for this growth was the rise of new innovations like remote dubbing that came to the rescue of an otherwise heavily impacted sector of the market. Lockdowns made it impossible to record from physical studios, and media localization companies had to figure out how to ensure business continuity. This heavily accelerated the move towards remote dubbing, which you can read more about in our recent report on remote recording solutions in the media localization industry. Looking ahead, we can expect a massive spike in production once the pandemic is behind us and restrictions loosen, which has already begun depending on the country you're in. This will translate into significant growth down the line for media localization. Another trend that I would like to highlight is the data for AI services. This has been one of the most hyped services for the language industry in recent years and is an area that continues to grow. Already in the 2020 edition of the Nimdzi 100, we mentioned that large players like TransPerfect, Lionbridge, and WeLocalize had identified AI support services such as data annotation and data labeling as growth drivers. And according to our survey this year, over 1/4 of translation companies are currently offering data and AI-related services. This service line is growing for both specialized and mature language data providers, as well as regular LSPs. One example that illustrates the transition in this field is Summa Lingua Technologies. The Polish company has shifted its focus from being a language service provider to becoming a multilingual data provider. And we can expect to see more of these shifts in the near future. In addition, companies who have already been offering both AI services and localization report that they are increasingly seeing a convergence of the two to the point where it is sometimes impossible to define whether a project is an AI project or a localization project. And we can expect this field of so-called AI localization to expand in the coming years as well. It should come as no surprise that the AI business is a lucrative field. But if there was ever any doubt, well, then Lionbridge selling its AI division to Thales will have eliminated that. The deal closed for almost $1 billion. And in case anyone wondered why Lionbridge would leave such a growing, lucrative field, well, they're not, at least not fully, because the company will continue its efforts in AI, but this time exclusively focused on language services, so for neural machine translation. That being said, it is worth pointing out that Appen's shares just dropped. The company is a veteran in the data for AI field and attributes the drop to increased competition. Well, you know, sounds like it. There's more people entering the space and a shift in priorities from its clients.
Speaking of clients, who are the buyers for data for AI services? So this is really going back to what we've been talking about here. is this whole idea of companies wanting to be as personalized as possible and appealing to their users, being relevant, staying relevant, and also, but also making strategic business decisions based on data. So what are the use cases for this type of service that is so hyped and everyone seems to be talking about? You've got the obvious suspects, big tech companies, Google, Apple, they have their voice assistants. So that is one of the use cases for data there to fuel personalized recommendations that are region or language specific, but also for search engines. So those would be ones, and really the ones that have the most money to spend on this. But then you have the whole field of Internet of Things with devices that are autonomous or smart and that touch on different aspects of our lives, whether that's in healthcare or consumer appliances we have at our homes. But another example that practically everyone knows about is in the automotive industry, the self-driving vehicles. So these, they also need these massive quantities of data. And then there's the e-commerce platforms, and we're talking about e-commerce a lot here, but it's for a reason. It's one of those industries that drive that are global and that drive conversations a lot, and they are tapping into all of this data as well to offer personalized product recommendations. So all of those things you see on the sidebar, chances are there's an AI model that is offering those to you when you're on Amazon or other services. And last but not least, but a trend that we're seeing as well is that it's the big LSPs that have a need to delegate and outsource this type of work, the data annotation, data collection and data annotation and labeling. And they are frequently resorting to working with smaller single language providers in a specific market. And the models there differ too. So some of these companies are either working directly or they have these huge networks of tens of thousands of freelancers or other companies that they work with. And some of those may be linguists, but not necessarily. That gives rise to a new type of job, and that is the data collector, really data annotator. So if you're wondering maybe how does this affect you, there might be one of the big LSPs soon knocking on your door and asking for help with this. So we've been talking a lot about the trends here, and we mentioned the effects of the pandemic throughout our presentation here. But we still want to address the elephant in the house, in the room, really. And we know that at this stage you probably are sick and tired of hearing about COVID, but it's still here. It's still happening, and it still conditions the way companies operate. So, Sarah, give us a few stats.
Absolutely. So, in our survey for the Nimdzi 100, close to 75% of respondents, so 3/4, reported that the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on their business. That shouldn't be a surprise. And this was whether, there was no judgment there, positive or negative, but there has been an impact. And one of the biggest impacts was the shift to remote work, as you can see on the slide here as well. So the language industry was already remote friendly before March 2020, but the pandemic took it to a completely new level. More or less overnight or over the weekend, players of all sizes had to move their entire operations and staff online. Well, the vast majority of companies that we interviewed pulled this off without major difficulty. And this new work from home situation changed the way we work, and we can expect it to have a lasting impact on our industry. Most companies we interviewed said that they are considering offering work from home options to their employees beyond the pandemic in a hybrid model. And this actually goes also not just for the language industry, but also to people like buyers that we interviewed from all types of verticals. So this whole hybrid model, I think, will be seen that across the globe, I would say, is fair to say. But what else was there? So after work from home, survey respondents also reported a decrease or loss of existing business and suspension or termination of work from clients due to the pandemic. But on a more positive note, close to 30% of respondents also saw an increase of existing business and a decrease in expenses because, for example, nobody was traveling, right? And some people didn't have to spend as much money on office space anymore. So there was a bit of an increase actually in profitability as well. When it comes to layoffs due to reduced volumes versus onboarding of new staff to handle increased volumes, the reported figures only vary slightly, as you can see in the graph. If you're looking at the impact of the pandemic, well, it is affecting different segments of the industry in different ways. In the healthcare and life sciences sector, for example, we saw a huge increase for anything related to COVID-19, but a significant decrease for anything non-essential, like elective surgeries, physical therapy, and routine consultations. These are picking up slowly again now, but that was the initial and larger impact. In the legal sector, it was mostly business as usual because people still need to be tried, right? But subsegments were affected in different ways. For example, in some countries, courts were closed for a while, or law firms were switching to video remote interpreting. Immigration has effectively come to a halt due to the imposed travel bans, of course. And in the government sector, demand was down by about 50% as governments were only focusing on essential services and COVID-19 related communication. Again, this is a segment that is starting to pick up again now as well. Well, then I want to highlight interpreting here. It's not often a service we highlight, to be honest. It's often seen as the little cousin of translation. But in this case, the interpreting market has arguably been the sector within the industry that was the most heavily affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, because prior to the pandemic, it was predominantly performed on site. So it should come as no surprise that on-site interpreting has been hit hard and has almost completely gone away with all the lockdowns and meeting restrictions. But in turn, then, we're seeing a boom for remote solutions. Of course, remote interpreting technology already existed before 2020, but the lockdown measures accelerated the growth in this field. Companies offering remote simultaneous interpreting, or RSI, experienced significant growth. I've talked to companies that have told me they grew by 7 times. Others have had demand shoot up by something crazy like 3,000%. So it's absolutely incredible. And there's been a lot of investment in this field as well as a byproduct of this. So Interactio, an RSI company based in Latvia, they just received funding of $30 million. Another company, Kudo, they're based in the US. They had previously already received 2 funding rounds with a total of $27 million. So with all these developments, RSI is really starting to move away from being a niche to becoming one of the biggest and fastest growing trends in the industry. And so much so that even companies from outside the industry are trying to cash in on this trend. Zoom, for example, has added interpreting as a feature. Zoom, as I'm sure you all know, we're using Zoom right now, is basically the most popular video conferencing platform. I mean, there's others, we all know them, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, WebEx, but Zoom is like, nobody can keep up with Zoom right now, right? So, and this is exactly part of the point. Clients like to use what they know. Like, yes, I want to have a multilingual meeting, but I want to do it on Zoom. So as a result, then, RSI providers at this stage, they basically have all found a way to somewhat integrate with Zoom. There's no proper integration yet, but everyone has found a way to work with Zoom, because while Zoom has its own interpreting feature, it's very rudimentary because, you know, it's not their focus. But most people have found a way to at least work with Zoom, and in this way been able to, you know, get a piece of the pie there as well. Then telemedicine was another area for growth for remote interpreting providers in 2020. Because of the strict safety measures, there have been increased remote consultations, right? Call your doctor before you go to the office. And of course, people from all language backgrounds need to be supported. And well, that just means one thing, and that means interpreting, right? So Language Line Solutions, the largest interpreting provider in the world, has long been active in the healthcare sector. So they were pretty well set up. And they were able to increase their revenue by close to $90 million in 2020. That is about the size of their next competitor. So that's pretty impressive. So based on our research, the future of interpreting will be a mix of adaptation and coexistence. Remote will not replace on-site interpreting, but we can expect that the current exposure of remote interpreting will have a lasting impact on the market, and that it will open the new doors to buyers who never even considered interpreting services before. Now, overall, what we're seeing is that in many ways, the COVID-19 pandemic has acted as an accelerator. It has intensified trends and widened the gap between those who already had remote solutions and digital offerings in place and those who did not. Companies who were already well set up, well, they thrived. Whereas those who ran entirely on-site focused operations, they saw an accelerated downturn. And in addition, the pandemic has also become somewhat of a catalyst for internal projects. Offering remote solutions and having a better digital presence, well, it suddenly moved from a nice to have, and we'll get to it someday, to a must have to keep businesses afloat, more or less overnight. A related trend here that we're seeing is that those who had the right technology in place, they won the race. They shot ahead of everyone else and increased their growth by being able to cash in on remote trends, like we mentioned, remote interpreting in the telehealth field or remote dubbing and media localization. And those who weren't set up properly, well, they were hastily trying to catch up, for example, by launching their own RSI platform or finally increasing their digital presence or increasing automation. So now that we know a little bit about the impact on of the pandemic, let's take a quick look at some of the strategies that LSPs employ to handle this new challenge. Well, during the early stages of the pandemic, helping customers move their business online became the #1 task for companies of all sizes, because any client that didn't already have a digital presence needed one now, and fast. On the translation side of the industry, this led to an increasing demand for website localization. On the interpreting side, corporate businesses and government entities alike were reaching out looking for remote interpreting solutions. And one thing, to consider, it's not just important, and I'm sure you all know this, that you and your staff are online and able to work remotely, but well, if your clients aren't able to do that, then that's no good for you, right? So you need to help your clients move their business online as well. So that was what people were busy with in the first few months. And customer service is, of course, always important, especially in a service industry. But especially in challenging times, it's a way where LSPs can really stand out by providing extra strong customer service, being available 24/7, quicker turnaround times, and things like this. Putting in extra time to educate their clients on the remote solutions. And that is exactly what happened as well. And then more than ever, LSPs also ramped up their sales and their marketing efforts. Because due to the lockdowns and the travel and meeting restrictions, the traditional sales channels like conferences, they were not available. So many ran more ads, campaigns, and reach out initiatives. And many said to us that they expanded their sales teams during this time in order to avoid losses, because it was a time to really ramp up your efforts. And in the same vein, also as digital marketing became more important, many expanded their marketing teams after March 2020. In addition, the pandemic forced many to take a closer look at their internal structures. For example, for some LSPs, it became all about managing cash flow. Others focused on investing in technology or increasing their digital presence. And as the pandemic affected different segments in different ways, like we already said, many LSPs already also reacted to this challenge by reshuffling their internal resources. So for example, assigning project managers that usually work in the travel division to the life sciences division, because travel was down, but life sciences was booming. And so this was something we've seen across the board, in addition to LSPs also assessing their client portfolios. Because once the pandemic hit, it became very apparent that LSPs with a diverse client base performed much better than those who derived most of their revenue from one or two large clients in a certain vertical. Okay, now we know the LSP side, but what about the buyers?
Yeah, absolutely. The buyer side is very much similar to the LSP side in that everyone has been affected in different ways, and the impact of COVID has been uneven, as you can imagine. Some industries have been hit harder than the others. So really, we're talking about a situation where there are really no rules in how to respond to a pandemic, or everyone was making them up on the fly. So two drivers there may have been costs. So of course, with an impact on sales for companies, there's less budget to go by, and it's the localization teams that we talk to, some of them have been affected. Budgets have been restricted. Most of the time, though, affecting elements such as staffing. So the growing the teams, or growing and expanding into other countries and spending more in a new language or three new languages have been initiatives that have been put on hold. However, they are there. It's what we see is the budgets are there and they are likely to pick back up. Or if those budgets have been cut in certain areas, they have been shifted to other areas. So you've seen probably a lot of companies going out of their way maybe to talk to their customers, to talk to the public, being extremely active on social media, showing understanding, showing empathy, and really insisting on that human element. So a lot of effort was poured into this human side of us doing business. So well, cost is it all comes down to it. So, and being more conscious of the way money is spent has certainly been one reaction, and how to optimize the efforts. And this has also trickled down to a lot of companies revising their operations, their language operations, and which partners they use, or they could maybe use less partners, or they could maybe refresh their technology setup. It's been an absolute and resounding yes to speaking the language of the users, and we don't mean this literally, but being there, being present. And LSPs have felt this as well. It's those that do the effort, put in the effort to communicate with the clients, that have and develop those relationships in a time of difficulty, and being understanding of that. These are the companies that have been able to weather the storm or course correct their actions. And this is regardless of whether we're talking about B2B or B2C types of companies. But an example we have here is from Skyscanner, and we all know that the travel industry was probably the one hit the hardest with the pandemic. So how Skyscanner reacted to this is they created this interactive map of a global map of different countries and the different levels of the restrictions that and rules that governments were putting into place to help their own users navigate the tricky waters of, okay, what it is that is happening and how are we reacting to the pandemic.
Okay, you made it. We're almost at the end now, and I'm very conscious that we are quite a bit over time, and because we still wanted to give you time for Q&A, so let's try to wrap this up. As it stands in June 21, we're still in a worldwide pandemic, and lockdown measures continue, varying degrees. Well, nobody has a crystal ball. We can't say for how long this is going to last, but what we do know is that once restrictions are lifted, we can expect an explosion of content. Once production can resume in the media space, the market will be flooded with new movies and TV shows. I personally can't wait, which will translate into a massive spike for media localization down the line. The travel and hospitality business plummeted during the pandemic, excuse me. But it is reasonable to assume that once people are allowed to travel again, this segment of the industry will see a significant boost as well. And in addition, once 5G becomes implemented, this will translate into new types of content that are available exponentially faster and at scale. So overall, we will see a lot more content in various areas, and that will all trigger into more demand for localization. And while not all trends and workarounds from the pandemic will remain in place, we can expect some trends and innovations to have a lasting impact, like the exposure to remote interpreting or remote dubbing that came to the rescue of two otherwise very heavily impacted segments of the market. So knowing all of this, what do you, the LSPs, need to do to be successful in a post-COVID world?
Right. The main recommendation from us would be to stop talking about COVID. As you've seen with the very first slide, and the data shows that our industry has fared pretty well And by and large, companies and LSPs have been reacting by the books to the pandemic, or as much as they could. So really, it's time to pivot away from the gloominess of the global pandemic and think ahead. How will you succeed in this new reality, in this new market? So really, these are the few elements that to take away is that with more content and companies wanting to react, being responsive to these shifting trends, time to market is more important than ever before. As we mentioned, we live in a tech-driven world, whether that's applicable for LSPs or end users or buyers. So it is important to understand what is the setup of your clients and who are the different stakeholders who have a say potentially in multilingual, multicultural content, and work with them to integrate as much as possible. And again, beating the drum of content, a lot of that is us as individuals, as end consumers, being vocal. If there's been anything, then the pandemic showed us how we empathize, how we found our voice and started reaching out. And this holds true for user-generated content that just more than ever before. And companies are looking at ways they can localize that. And technology such as MT is certainly one way to go about it. And even though we mentioned that, or as we mentioned that the MT is something driven by the buyers, those who have been behind on the buyer side and who haven't used it so far, they most certainly are looking at it right now. So having a solution at the ready for them will be important. And last but not least, something we like to say to LSPs is that you are the experts. You know what it takes to adapt a product from an English or other language source to the target markets. You know about the do's and don'ts. So tap into your expertise and look at ways you can generate value add services and content that affirms you as the experts for your languages and the markets you cover. And with that, we're just about run out of time, but we have a little bit of time for Q&A. We talked a lot, so we appreciate you bearing with us. But we have the space for Q&A. If anyone has a couple of questions, we can certainly take them.
Yes.
Thank you, Sarah and Gabriel. I had one small question. I actually typed it in the chat already. It was, at least to me, it's a new one, this stack term that you used. Perhaps you could explain it shortly.
Of course. So technology stack, by that we understand the suite of technology, of the different tools that buyers have on their end. And that can be a content management system, so the place where the content is being generated. That can be product information databases. So imagine an e-commerce platform, they need to centralize that somewhere, the different information on the products. That can be customer support type of technology. And by tech stack, we refer, or at least in this context, we refer to as the kind of ecosystem of different tools, different departments on the buyer end use in order to carry out their work. It can also be product design type of technology. So that's where we mentioned the tech stack and how LSPs they need to find out what it is that's on the buyer side and integrate with that as much as possible in their workflows.
Great, thank you. So please, our audience, shoot away with your great questions.
Do not hesitate. Great. And if you cannot think of any questions on the spot, we invite you to reach out to us, contact us. We are very approachable. You have our emails here. Feel free to comment or ask the questions via email. We'll be looking forward to that. So unless anyone has any questions here, we can, wrap it up.
I suppose we will be wrapping up if that is the case. And on behalf of Sky, Finnish Language Service Providers Association, thanks again, Sarah, Gabriel, for your insights and from offering us from the treasure troves of Nimdzi databases and experiences. And thank you, audience. Until next time.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
Appreciate your time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.